the rain or shine. She's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie the Riveter keeps a sharp lookout for sabotage. Sitting up there on the fuselage, that little frail can do more than a male can do. Rosie the Riveter.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for our Reconsidering Rosie the Riveter program this afternoon. My name is Amanda, and I work at the Heinz History Center as the manager of school programs. And I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today. I will be joined by two of my colleagues. One is Jocelyn. You will see her name come up in the chat. And Leslie, who I will introduce in just a second here. But just some housekeeping notes before we get started with our program today. This is a webinar, so while you can see and hear us and you will see our presentation, we are not able to see or hear any of you. And so the way that you can communicate with us as we go through the program is by using the chat and the Q&A. And so you will see at the bottom of your screen, I'm sure most of you are familiar with all of this by now, there will be a chat function. The chats that you put in there will just come to us as panelists, so that's you talking directly to Jocelyn and Leslie and I. And you can also use the Q&A function if you have questions while we go through the presentation. There will be a few points where we do ask for your input, so feel free to use the chat to talk to us. We really want to hear from you today. And so we are recording this webinar so that we can share it with people in the future, just so that you're aware. And there is also a live captioner working with us today to caption this entire program. If you would like to access those captions, there is a CC button at the bottom of your screen there. And we will put a note in the chat as well, just to make sure that people can get into the captions if they would like to. We are going to be going until about 1:45. It might run a few minutes over today if we have some questions at the end that we want to cover. But I am going to go ahead and get us started here. So today is a webinar called Reconsidering Rosie the Riveter. This is happening because March is Women's History Month, if you didn't know, and Rosie the Riveter is a really, really interesting topic for us to sort of unpack during Women's History Month. It was also Rosie the Riveter Day on Sunday, I believe, March 21st. So this is a very timely presentation. And so today we are going to be hearing mostly from our senior curator at the Heinz History Center. Her name is Leslie Przybylek. And Leslie worked on an exhibit that we had at the History Center a few years ago that was all about World War II. So Leslie has done a lot of research about World War II. She has also done a lot of work on women's history in this area. And so Rosie the Riveter is very much in line with Leslie's work. So she's put together a nice presentation for you today. To sort of dig a little bit deeper into the story of Rosie than we often do when we talk about her. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Leslie and let her get started. Again, if you have questions or anything as we go through, feel free to drop those in the chat and Q&A. Over to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Amanda. And to all of you, this is, as Amanda and I were talking about beforehand, this is a topic with so many things we could talk about that I know I will not cover everything that you might be expecting or you might have other questions. Please don't hesitate to ask us as we move forward with the program. So I'm going to share my screen here and thank you. I know it's such a beautiful day out. Thank you to all of you for being here. And the program is Reconsidering Rosie the Riveter. And I wanted to start today, as Amanda mentioned, this past Sunday was National Rosie the Riveter Day. And also there recently was a new Congressional Gold Medal awarded to what was called Rosie the Riveter. In effect, all the women who participated in defense activities during World War II. But for those of you who are participating today, I wanted to start by encouraging you to take a minute whether you're in a group or by yourself, and think, when you hear the phrase Rosie the Riveter, what do you think about? What comes to mind for you? And I'm sure that some of you, one of the first things that might come into your head would be this poster. We use her all the time at the Heinz History Center. It's really the We Can Do It poster. It was not specifically named Rosie, although she has become completely connected with the idea of Rosie the Riveter now. She was part of a poster series created by Pittsburgh artist J. Howard Miller. And she was done probably in late 1942 or so. She was part of a large series he did where every 2 weeks, Westinghouse factories during World War II would post these images. So this poster went up from February 15th to February 28th, 1943, to encourage people to work together, to work harder. It was in effect a propaganda poster. And don't get me wrong, even though it wasn't really a public image, Westinghouse had factories all across the eastern United States. Hundreds of thousands of people probably saw this poster, even if you're only considering those 2 weeks when it would have been displayed in a factory. But this is a really interesting example of something whose meaning becomes even more over time. The poster was kind of, in a sense, rediscovered in the 1980s and 1990s. And we're going to talk about this idea of context and how important it is multiple times in this webinar. So I wanted to make sure that you understood this piece of it. You know, in 1980s and the 1990s, people began thinking about the 40th and 50th anniversaries of World War II, an event that happened in the 1940s, from 1941 for the United States to 1945. You even had someone like Tom Brokaw, whose book called The Greatest Generation was actually published in 1998. He'd been working on it for a few years. So suddenly people are thinking about World War II in much deeper and much different ways than they have for a long time. And this poster really became part of the national consciousness regarding World War II. So when I say that this version of what we now think of as Rosie is everywhere, I mean, she's everywhere. This is just, I could do pages upon pages of this. Everybody from Michelle Obama to a version that Beyonce posted. I think Beyonce's version here was posted on Instagram in 2014. And today, with the coronavirus pandemic, there is a whole slew of new images that have come out using this idea to portray our medical personnel and our frontline workers who have been dealing with the pandemic. Now, you can, of course, Google the same things I can, and you might know that at various times, people have different feelings about what this image means. For example, when Beyonce posted her version of the image, there were even some people who criticized her and they said, oh, you know, it doesn't really mean what you think it means. I will tell you that I don't agree with that, but it got me thinking, how can we understand and put this image into more context? And so what I'm hoping that we can do in the program today is really think about the background, the origin of Rosie the Riveter, and really then look at some of the issues that the women who went to work in those factories really faced. Now, of course, the thing you need to know first is that Rosie was a character introduced in a song that was written in 1942 by a New York songwriting team, Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb. And I don't want to call them a one-hit wonder, but I will say it's pretty true that this is the most well-known song that collectively they wrote. And in fact, for this period in mid to late 1942, they weren't the only ones thinking about this. I have been working on some other World War II and women's history content and actually found that there was another song that a New York kind of comedian and songwriter wrote in August 1942 that might even predate the earliest published version of Rosie, that was called Winnie the Welder. People are thinking about women in the workforce at this time period. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in a minute. Now, there are multiple claims about who might have been the real model for Rosie, and we'll never truly sort those out today, but just know that there were a number of women whose stories were published in newspapers and other places at the time. And I think in some ways it was the collective understanding of, wow, look at what's happening in the world around us, that helped really inspire these songs. Now, for Rosie the Riveter, the song, Americans first heard it on the radio at the end of 1942. For example, it was sung on the Ozzie and Harriet show. And I'm sure that most of you, especially students, have not heard that show. I will say that there's a set of links that I've given to Amanda that go along with this. And there's a link to the episode in which this song was sung. And then in early 1943, multiple groups recorded this song and it was issued on records. Now, the way that kind of thing worked in 1943, multiple groups would record a song and release it. The version you heard as this webinar was getting started was one of the most popular, and over time it has become the most well-known. And it's a version that was recorded by a group called the Four Vagabonds. And I have to say that it's really important that they were one of the groups that recorded this song. The Four Vagabonds were an African-American singing quartet from St. Louis who were really popular in the 30s and through the early 50s. They're really considered one of the precursors to what will become R&B later in the 50s. So think about that, because one of the questions we'll be looking at later is this question of, when you talk about Rosie, were these jobs just as open to African-American women as to white women? Now, I do want to add one note here. For those of you who might not be familiar with what it is, what the heck is a riveter? When you say Rosie the Riveter, what do we mean? If you see her gun there and those little round, they're actually supposed to be little pegs. They're like large nails. The rivet gun was something that drove those pegs into metal. And the real team, there would have been two people helping with this. Someone who had the gun doing the riveting, and then someone else to help hold it steady. So a real Rosie who was riveting probably would have had a partner, and she probably would have been closer to that thing, that piece that she's using to rivet with there. But in this case, if you notice behind that, riveting was connected largely with the aircraft industry. I'll show you in a minute what the equivalent to that would have been for Pittsburgh. So Rosie the Riveter, the character, became hugely popular very quickly. So popular that by May of 1943, probably the most famous artist ever to create an image of her, Norman Rockwell, did one that appeared on the cover of Saturday Evening Post. And it's really hard for me today to just describe how well known and how broad an appeal the Saturday Evening Post had at that time. And yes, there were multiple sizes of rivet guns. If you look at this rivet gun, and then you look at this rivet gun, you might be thinking, that's a huge change in what these women are holding, but there were different sizes. Now, before I go on to really dig a little bit deeper into the background of how we learn more about the real Rosies, I'm going to let Amanda come on and do a little bit of visual analysis with this pair of Rosies.
Thanks, Leslie. I just have one question actually that came up in the Q&A while you were talking. It kind of ties to what we're about to start talking about here. And a student asked why, when you started talking about these posters, you used the word propaganda. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about, what that means when you're talking about something like this being shown in a factory.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Of course, propaganda is material that's designed to create a certain viewpoint and get you to think from the perspective of the person who's creating the image. And so when we say propaganda for World War II, and that's a word that I think now we think of it as having just a negative meaning, but it's not. It's just this idea of propaganda is something that's trying to get a certain point of view across and convince you to do something. These were propaganda posters in the factory because they were made specifically to encourage the workers in the factory to model certain kinds of behavior. Other posters in the Howard Miller series, for example, encourage people to be careful on the job. You don't want to miss work because you're injured. This one is really encouraging them to work together, come into the plant, show resolve, be a team, and I think one of the things we'll get into a little bit more in the discussion after the visual analysis is, you know, this poster is aimed at workers at a time when you might have had a lot of new people. A lot of these women who are working in the plants at this time, they had never worked in a factory before. So when I say propaganda, I mean that it's a set of posters from beginning to end of the series that are created to get people to work like a team, to be on time for work, to be safe on the job. It's things that are encouraging certain kinds of behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Excellent. Okay, so as we get into this next section here, we're going to be looking at these two images and kind of comparing them. And this is where we really want you to use the chat to communicate with us, because what I'm going to ask you to do is to take a really good look at this picture here on the left, as Leslie gave us some information about that it came from the Saturday Evening Post, so a really, really popular magazine or publication that a lot of Americans read. And this is the cover of this magazine. So we're just going to take a moment and look at it. And anything that you notice that you think is interesting, you can go ahead and put in the chat. And then we can sort of pick apart this image and see what details Norman Rockwell put into this image that help us to understand more about Rosie, or maybe give us an idea of what point he was trying to make about Rosie and the people, the women like her around the country. And so as I'm looking at the chat here, I can see things start to come in, which is great. So feel free to keep dropping your ideas in there. I can see that it looks like people are maybe starting from the top of the image and working down. So we're getting comments that she looks a little bit dirty, right? It looks like she's been at work in a factory, right? She's got maybe like some grease or something on her arms there. This is great. Lots coming in through the chat here.
And I just want to point out that we are talking about the image on the left. So I see most of you going that way, but I also see someone comparing them already.
Okay, yeah, and we will get to the comparison certainly. But yes, we're focusing on this Saturday Evening Post picture here on the left.
So we have people mentioning her actions, that she's eating a sandwich, and then looking really close, like especially on what she's standing on top of, which is a newspaper.
Mhm.
Oh, yes. It looks like there's something under her feet there.
Yes, look at that piece more closely. Is it a newspaper or a book?
Someone said they thought it was a newspaper, but I'm sure we'll get into that a little more.
And it might be a book that students aren't necessarily familiar with, because I think that probably most of you have not read that book. I've not read that book.
Yeah. So we have a few adjectives that people are using, like muscular and masculine and tough.
Yeah, her arms are very strong in this picture, and her forearms and everything. Yeah, she looks very tough. Very good.
Mentioning the badges on her chest at the top of her uniform.
Yeah, she's got this string of badges all across her chest. And if you look at one of them in particular, there's a sort of bigger badge that's a little bit lower than the others, and that's her work badge. And so that would be a picture of her and maybe her employee number, so that people in the plant would know that she was supposed to be there. It's sort of like your teachers at school probably have them too on a lanyard, just a little badge that says that they're supposed to be where they are. You'll notice that both Rosie images have a badge like that as well.
So we have two more people pointing out that book under her foot and mentioning that it's Hitler's Manifesto, or Mein Kampf, which is Nazi propaganda.
Yes.
And then we
absolutely.
have someone in the background with the American flag that's behind her.
Yeah, really strong patriotic imagery coming through there with that flag in the background for sure. I saw someone say something about her shoes. And this is interesting. I actually had to look up that sort of backstory. And apparently the explanation given for the fact that she's just wearing like loafers, like normal shoes, but she's working in this factory, is that they didn't make work boots that men would wear in women's sizes for a little while. It took a while for that to kind of catch up to the fact that women were going to work. And so she's wearing just her own shoes, basically.
And I'm glad that came up, Amanda, because we had a question in the Q&A asking, is this like the uniform that she would actually be wearing? Or that woman would wear during this time?
For some factories, yes, it would have been. And there were also, by the time you're talking early to mid 1943, there were also a lot of companies who had started marketing these sort of work jumpsuits to women.
Okay.
It does look like both Rosies have the same kind of thing too. So it does make me think that must have been pretty common. I saw someone noticing that her lunchbox is there under her arm. She's got her box that says Rosie on it. We have some of those in our handling collection, actually, those old factory lunch boxes. And someone mentioned that she has things in her pocket as well. So on the other side of her body from the lunchbox, there is a handkerchief in her pocket and a compact, which is basically, and some people still have these. It's like a little, it would have like a mirror and maybe some makeup inside of it so that, you know, when she's at work, if she needs to fix her face a little bit, she's got that to hand so she can do that. I guess that kind of gives us that idea that while she does look very tough and she is holding a riveting gun and like squashing Hitler's manifesto and all of that, she is still a lady and she has her compact in her pocket. Anything else you're noticing in there, Jocelyn?
I'm seeing this really good one of kind of talking about the riveting gun that she's using, and like you could tell it's being used heavily and that's not just there for show.
Oh, that's a good observation.
Yeah, like it's got frayed edges on it and like parts where it looks like it's been repaired in the middle, and yeah, it's covered in grease and things. Yeah, it very much looks like she might just be on her lunch break with her tools at hand. Yeah, absolutely. Someone noticed the goggles as well. Those are basically the 1943 version of just like safety glasses that people wear when they're working in factories and things today. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I think we picked out a lot of really important things in this. When Norman Rockwell was making his works of art like this Rosie picture, they were designed to sort of do what we're doing, right? Noticing these little details and kind of drawing out the story here. That's especially the case when we see that book at the bottom of that image where she's kind of squashing Mein Kampf. And this is something that happens a lot in all different kinds of works of art. If a person is pictured with their feet on something, that's like the thing under there is something that is bad. They're trying to do away with that. And so, you know, this is, and you notice the other things that are being talked about in the Saturday Evening Post. If you see that little piece of text next to her, Edgar Snow reports on German atrocities. A lot of people were really paying attention to what was going on in Germany and what, you know, Hitler's ideas were. And so that idea that women going to work is helping the country to do away with Hitler and Mein Kampf's ideas is really, really an important part of this picture. And you can keep putting things in the chat about that one, but I do want to make sure that we keep to time and switch over to doing the same kind of thing for the poster that most people know as Rosie the Riveter, right? This We Can Do It poster that Leslie gave us a little bit of information about already. What do we notice about this version of Rosie, the picture on the right-hand side? Let's see.
Right away, someone's saying that she looks much cleaner.
I don't see any grease on her arms in that picture. Let's see what else is
a lot more feminine. She has that headband on that's pulling her hair back.
Yes, and so people mentioned the red bandana, and that makes me think of this idea too, that both of these pictures are using sort of primary colors, very clear, crisp use of color. That red and blue and yellow being very, very strong and bold in both images, a little more so in this one on the right. But yeah, absolutely. Her red bandana is something, you know, when people dress up as Rosie for Halloween or whatever, that's always the giveaway that they are Rosie the Riveter. Anything else popping up in there?
Someone pointed out, although like it is a feminine picture, she's still not afraid to show like her masculine features, like her muscles or like her
She's
tough
still,
expression.
Yeah, she looks very quite stern, right? She's still showing off her muscles under that sleeve there. A lot of people I can see are mentioning her makeup, and I think that is a really interesting. I mean, her eyebrows are perfect, her eyelashes are perfect. It's almost like she's got contouring on her, like she is fully done to go to work in the factory, which is a very different contrast to the other Rosie, right? The on the left there, the Saturday Evening Post version. You can tell that she has a little bit of lipstick on and maybe a little bit of blush on her cheeks, and she has her compact, so you know she's interested in that. But the makeup is not something that is front and center in that picture like it is in the one on the right here. Absolutely.
There was one comment earlier about her looking like she was challenging us, kind of with her gaze, because she's looking directly at us.
Yeah, she is looking straight at anyone who's looking at that poster is looking right at Rosie's eyes. Absolutely. Yeah, so it gives them more of like a that like we can do it message, and that eye contact is very much like drawing you in and encouraging you, which knowing that it was shown in factories makes perfect sense, right? I think it is. When Leslie was talking about propaganda, that's exactly what we're talking about there.
And there are other posters in the series that do the same thing. I have one at the end I can show in the Q&A if we want.
And then again, some people are mentioning the pin on her shoulder, which I guess they're kind of relating it to the pin that the first one had and saying it might be from the company she worked for.
Yeah, and if you were able to zoom in really close, you would see on this, the one on the right, it says Westinghouse Electric Company on that badge. So you're
that really is an evocation of their badges. Their badges really were round and they looked like that.
With all these observations coming in, I have a few questions in the Q&A. Someone was asking, was this a poster people got to buy? And I know you spoke a little bit about that earlier in saying where this poster was posted in the company, Leslie.
Yeah, I don't want to be categorical about that, but I doubt that this was something you could have bought at the time, because what probably happened is that Westinghouse had them printed and they simply they shipped a set out to every factory, and it would have been a manager or a facilities person who put those up in every factory. Now, it could have been something where after the 2 weeks were done and they put up the next poster, they might have said, hey, who wants these? Because these would have been coming down. And I can very easily imagine people saying, oh yeah, I'll take that poster. I want a copy of that. But from what I know and what we've seen, it doesn't really seem as if the image was really widely available for sale until it came back many years later in the 1980s, essentially. I know that it was for sale on items once you get to the 80s.
great. All right. Well, I think we all did a really great job sort of pulling apart those images and looking for all the details. I think there is a lot to compare and contrast there. And Leslie's going to move on now and give us some more information about women who actually experienced this and what happened as the story goes on.
Okay, thank you.
As we move on, Leslie, I just want you to keep this one question that someone had in the Q&A in mind. Okay. They were asking, what kind of effect did Rosie have on women's equality?
Okay, I think that is a question that some of what I'm going to discuss next, we'll get to pieces of that. And then I think that's a really good question for us to come back to at the end, because the last piece that I talk about really impacts that specific question. So let's keep that in mind as we work through these things.
Thank you.
First thing I wanted to talk just a little bit about is, how do we find out more about this topic? And there are multiple ways that you can research and find out the stories of the real people who were involved with this and the kind of situation that they found themselves in. So 4 good kinds of materials, and these would be primary source materials for you teachers, would be things, for example, like the poster on the far left side of this screen, government reports, posters, documents, the Bureau of Labor, things like that. Now, that might seem like a relatively dry source of information, but even looking at a set of posters, how did the way that women were portrayed change from, say, 1941 to 1945? Now, another really good source that we use and that I've used for some of this information today are personal archives and collections. The image you see here shows 3 sisters, and I'll talk about them a little bit more in a moment, but it's 3 sisters who all went to work as welders at one local factory. There have been a lot of people, especially since the 1990s, who have kind of gathered oral histories related to these women who we now call the Rosies. And you can find them, and I've included a resource sheet that gives you a couple places to start with that. There's also newspapers. Newspapers are a wonderful way to learn more about how this story was depicted during the 1940s and really even into the early 1950s. Now, the headline you see on this example I've chosen might give you a surprise for a moment. Rosie the Riveter, fast disappearing from payroll. I'm also going to come back and talk about that too. And in fact, when you just asked that question about equality, my last piece is about this question of what happened to these women after the war was over. And the newspapers are one of the best ways to find out what everybody was saying about that at the time. Another source would be the archives and the records, the photos of companies. The poster we've been talking about, We Can Do It, is a corporate piece of history. It's a poster that was created by Westinghouse, and it's a part of their much larger record of what they were doing and how they encouraged women workers, encouraged them to work for them during World War II. There's another source, and in fact, it's one that includes the song Rosie the Riveter, and that is what we call popular culture. Cartoons and comics, movies. This image on the left of this screen, Rosie the Riveter, is a film. We actually just added a copy of this poster to our collection at the History Center. Now, popular culture really is something that responds to other things going on in the world around you. You might create a cartoon, but if you have a cartoon and the people who are looking at it don't get the joke, then it's not funny. So when you see something like the cartoon in the upper right corner of this screen, you see this woman she's got her rivet gun, which hopefully you can recognize now that we showed you the example on the Saturday Evening Post. And she's saying, oh, look, George, the hall rug won't slip anymore. She's showing her newfound skills of using the rivet gun to make sure that hall rug is attached to the floor. If enough people by 1943 didn't understand what she was doing, that wouldn't have been a cartoon that was funny. So you need to use popular culture sources carefully, but if you understand the context, they can be a wonderful source of information. And I'm going to come back to one of those in a moment, that one at the bottom that says, and then in my spare time. So remember that. So what are some ways that we can really think about the experiences of these real women? And I mentioned at the outset, this question of context. That is, what is happening at the time around the piece that you're looking at that might help you understand it more. And if you notice, all of the posters and the pieces we've talked about, the song Rosie the Riveter, which is written in 1942, and becomes popular in 1943. The poster for Westinghouse, probably created in late 1942, released in 1943, and that Saturday Evening Post cover, May 1943. Why do all these things share the same rough time period? It's because when you're talking about women and their work during World War II, there's really a specific period of time that impacted them the most. Pittsburgh starts fighting the war in 1940 because the factories are already producing things, but the men are still here. It's only after Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, and through early 1942, as the men are pulled away to the war, that you begin to see a greater need for other workers. It's no accident that a song like Rosie the Riveter emerges in later 1942, because that's when you begin to see more and more places looking for women workers. And the height of the time when they're working really lasts from about 1942 through 1944. Now, what was the real experience of some of these people? How do we put this idea of women working into context? Because the reality is that there were a lot of women working long before World War II. There were women who were doing many jobs in our workforce: teachers, nurses. There were a lot of people, for example, who were working as domestics. That's a maid. In fact, the image you see on the right side of your screen, Julie Ann and V. Georgievic, those are the three sisters I mentioned before who went to work at Dervaux. The oldest one of them was working as a maid before she learned that Dervaux was hiring welders. Then her sisters followed her. But working in a factory was a much greater way for her to make more money than working as a maid. And so she switched jobs. That was really common during this period. When we talk about Rosie the Riveter, it's not so much the idea that women went to work. In fact, there were women who worked in factories during World War I, but it's that you had more women who were taking these jobs that previously had been done only by men. Welders, riveters, those were jobs that men did. We talked in the previous analysis about her work shoes, and they didn't have any safety shoes for women at first. Women had to learn how to do these jobs. Another thing that they really had to step up and do, and that wasn't easy, was they didn't just walk into a factory and get a job as a welder or get a job as a riveter. They had to go through training to do that. The two photos you see here both show women who worked at Dervaux. That was a large company in Pittsburgh that during the war made these huge ships. They were ocean-going transport ships. Now, actually, in previous times, much of the work to do those ships actually would have used riveting. But for the company in Pittsburgh, one of the things they innovated was a way to create those ships with welding certain seams instead of riveting. So when you see these images of women welders, they're actually Pittsburgh's version of Rosie the Riveter. They had to go to a training school. So Dervaux began creating training schools for women probably in very late 1942. I've even seen sources that suggest that it was late as December 1942. They learned, and then they went into the factory. And while we look at this today, and we know that this was really important work, you know, them going in and doing what had been a man's job wasn't smiled upon by everybody. When these women went into a factory, sometimes because what they were doing was so important and so needed, they would in effect do what we would call jumping the line. In a steel mill, for example, during normal time before the war, when a man got a job there, he would start as a laborer and work his way up from the bottom. But when they needed women to do certain jobs, they sometimes got in doing a higher job than they would have done in other times. But that's because the war and the need to do certain things changed how the factories worked. But just imagine these young women, you have to learn how to do a skill you've never done before. You have to learn how to behave and be safe on the job. And some people might not have been completely happy to see you there. And you get a sense of just what kind of strength and resolve they needed. And another piece that we don't really think about, but you know, there weren't as many cars on the road at that time, and gasoline and tires, because both fuel and rubber were valuable to the war effort, were rationed or limited and hard to come by. So there's a lot of women. It's not unusual to hear stories that they took two buses and they commuted 2 hours to get to a job at a factory. Or some, and I have to emphasize the message, don't do this at home, some even hitchhiked, or they found rides wherever they could. And they might not, in some cases, have even known week to week, their arrangements might have changed. Just imagine that on top of everything else, you had to figure out how to get to work. Now, I mentioned the song version of Rosie the Riveter that was done by the recording group, the Four Vagabonds. There's a really important question as part of this. were these jobs as open to African-American women as to other members of the community? And that is an answer that is similar to other things, both yes and no. Technically speaking, it was clear by 1941 that this was going to be a problem, and President Roosevelt actually issued what he called Executive Order 8802, which made it illegal to discriminate against people for industry jobs. It was supposed to be an even playing field. You see the image on the left here. These are women welders from a plant in New Britain, Connecticut. To be honest, our collection at the History Center doesn't have a lot of good images or stories about African-American Rosies in effect. The challenge with, even though something like Executive Order 8802 existed, was that how did women find out about jobs in these factories? A lot of it was word of mouth. V. Georgievic knew about a job, she got her sisters into the plant. If you're a woman, you might have heard about these jobs through a family member, through friends, through the hiring manager at that plant. This was especially true of steel mills, where a lot of women, even later, the oral histories for the steel mills during World War II remembered that a lot of these jobs were word of mouth. If you look in the newspapers for Draveau, you'll see a lot of positions advertising for women workers. They're almost never for welders. They're for typists and clerks and things like that. So even though it was illegal to discriminate, if the jobs are word of mouth, who do you think has the best chance to find them? That's right, the people who are part of the inner group whose family and friends are already there. That doesn't mean that there weren't other opportunities. This image on the right side of the screen, one of the best images we have, one of the best stories in our collection about a woman, an African-American woman who served as a Rosie in effect during the war, was Althea Skelton, who was a Pittsburgh resident who went west with her husband. He ended up in the military, and he actually served eventually in the Aleutian Islands. That's out in Alaska, but she didn't go to Alaska. She stayed in Seattle and worked at the Boeing plant there, building B-29 bombers, which is incredibly cool as a job for any woman to be doing during the war. And that was typical. You see all those, here's Althea. She's the one, the blue arrow is pointing towards Althea and the rest of the members of her work crew. So it's one of those typical stories where you're right, it was illegal. But the informal networks that help to gain access, create access, and ensure continued information about jobs wasn't as open to them. Now, two other areas to really think about connected with Rosie. And they're things that tend to sometimes surprise people. And when we talk about things like the impact on the question of women's equality, there are two really important points. Look at the cartoon on the left. This actually was a government created cartoon. OWI meant the Office of War Information. By 1943, there were times when the government had a really difficult time recruiting women to go into factory jobs. You can see this reflected in Pittsburgh. You'll have periods where there's a lot of stories about, and there really was a contest for Miss Victory and a lot of women, and then there will be a lull and you will see newspaper stories appear again. Oh no, we don't have enough women to do these jobs. We really need 5,000 more women to sign up to work in the steel industry. What's going on? If you look at this picture, what's she doing? She's a welder and she's there with all her children. And I'll tell you, some of us who have been working in the pandemic and we have friends or family or even you, many of you teachers, you're probably trying to do your job and your kids are right there too. I think these Rosies in the 1940s would have greatly sympathized with what people have encountered during this pandemic, because their challenge was that while they were doing the factory work, they were also carrying the load for everything at home. And there are women who quite clearly said, wait a minute, every male relative I know is overseas. There were entire streets where every husband and son was gone. I'm taking care of the house. I'm doing all of the housework, all of the work with the children. I'm maintaining a car. I've never done that before. I'm maintaining the plumbing. I've never done that before. Rationing, that's controlling the supply of things. Rationing resulted in a very complicated set of coupons and coins for what you could buy for food. Life was more complicated. And these women were saying, I can't cover all this. And so you would even see recruiting films where they'd say, oh, look, Mrs. Beadle is serving her 9 family members dinner and doing the laundry. And then she is going to her factory job at the Curtiss Wright plant, making airplane propellers, trying to convince them to take these jobs. And you know what happened? And this cartoon directly connects with this. There were government daycare operations and factory daycare operations created to help care for women's children in some cases, so that while they were working, there was someone else watching the children. It's one of the areas that we don't necessarily think about. And when you see the "We Can Do It" woman, the poster, we look at her and we see her as an individual. But the reality is that for many of these women, and there were a lot of single women, but there were also a lot of married women who took these jobs during the war, that it was much more complicated because they had to care for homes and families and everybody else who was within their sphere. It wasn't just about them as individuals. Now, the other thing that is really tricky about the story of Rosie the Riveter, and it's the piece that is always mentioned when you have these questions about women's equality, is that what happened to Rosie at the end of the war. And you see this news clipping. This one happens to be from the Lancaster New Era, March 1946, but it is a National News Service article, which means it appeared in many newspapers. And what does that headline say? It says, Rosie the Riveter fast disappearing from factory jobs. And to be honest, there were some companies, and this is true of multiple places in Pittsburgh, when World War II ended, when the American forces dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, there were companies that shed thousands of jobs and cut off certain contract work the week after that. So this clipping dates to March 1946, but frankly, there were a lot of people who found that they were out of those jobs as early as August and September 1945. Why didn't Rosie keep those jobs? Or did they want to? How did women feel? You'll see sometimes people are saying, well, why didn't Rosie fight for that job in effect? And it's a really complicated answer, and there are multiple pieces. And you can see in this newspaper article, their conjecture is a number of things. It's true. Many of these women took these jobs and knew that when the war was over, the men would come home and would take those jobs again. That's the way they were portrayed in many of the recruiting ads at the time. They were convinced to do your patriotic duty, and then we're behind the men, we're gonna win this war, and when the war is over, you're going home and he's taking the job back. And I have to tell you that for a lot of the women at the time, it's clear from letters and from the way a lot of women remembered it, that they didn't have a problem with that at the time, because in effect, it's the way that they knew things would go. Don't mistake me. That doesn't mean that everybody was happy about it. There have been studies that have been done that showed that a healthy percentage of women would have been happy keeping those jobs. That's not everybody. There were others who clearly did it just because it was something patriotic to do, and they had a chance to earn more money, and they were happy to go back to what they saw as a normal life after the war. But there were clearly others who would have preferred not to do that. Now, there were many women who stayed in the workforce. In fact, women in the workforce in general, the numbers after World War II were higher than they had been before the war, and they stayed that way. So it's just that they weren't continuing in those jobs that had been done by men. But there are clear examples of a woman who was doing chemical analysis with stuff during the war, who then went into something related to medical labs. keeping up with the science she had learned, or a number of examples of women who would continue in a plant, just in a different capacity. For teachers, there's actually a really good blog post that appeared this week with the Rivers of Steel blog about the Silhouettes, a professional group that came out of US Steel, where they were the women clerical and managerial workers. So there were women who went back into the front office, but they continued to stay engaged with those industries. So how do we make sense of this last piece of the story today? Because there are people who look at the poster, we can do it, and say, well, but she only could do it during the war and then she had to go home. Scholars think about it in a couple different ways. There was discrimination, and there were real pressures at that time for women to go back to the home. And of course, you'll have this rise of this domestic ideal in the 1950s, but then talk to the daughters of those women. And a really good example, I showed you the image of the 3 Georgievic sisters. One of them, Anne, her daughter, Kathleen, later wrote a book about some of her things her mother had talked to her about and some of her own experiences. She saw what her mother had done. She, the daughter, became an engineer and eventually ran her own firm. There are scholars who really look at this and believe that even if that generation of women then went from the factory and went home, what it did, it established that second generation who was aware of what was possible and then did more. So the question about women's equality is a fair one, and it's a tricky answer. Rosie in 1942 was not created as the icon of equality that we think of today. She represented a different set of society beliefs at the time, but the experience during the war showed a lot of women that there were things they could do that nobody had a right to tell them not to do. And in that sense, it actually fits back really well as we're looking at the history of women in general to World War I, where women who had served overseas and in factories during that war actually helped gain women the right to vote, because it was after World War I when enough people realized, oh, wow, look what women can do, that we actually saw the push to pass the amendment giving women the right to vote. So the figure of Rosie the Riveter is complicated. She's not an easy symbol, but she really did symbolize women, one, stepping up and doing a job that needed to be done at a time when it was crucial. And over time, she became the symbol of women realizing that there was so much more that they could do, and that it was within both their right and their obligation to fight for that. So that's a really, really quick version of some of the deeper level behind Rosie the Riveter. And I think we'll do some Q&A, and I welcome any of your questions.
Thanks so much, Leslie. That was really great and really informative, and we've had some great questions come through. I just want to say out loud to people who are watching, we have gone over on time a little bit, and if you do need to go, that's fine. But we do have a couple questions that I would like to see if you can answer for us.
Okay.
There are 2 sort of related questions here about how men maybe responded to the Rosie posters. Like, did they take this initiative seriously? And did women who were taking those jobs face any bullying or sort of backlash from men in the factory? And you talked a little bit about that, but I wonder if you know anything about, women actually experiencing any of that sort of.
I think what I'll say is this. I don't have a lot of direct research knowledge on the question of bullying, although I suspect that there probably were men who did feel some resentment, and there might have been some showing of that. I do suspect, though, that because it was so urgent during the war to keep these factories manned, that even if some of the workers might have had real problems with this, and in another situation, it could have led to more overt bullying. With managerial sides of things here, I think there probably would have been a push to nip that kind of behavior in the bud as soon as possible, because there were quotas for what they're trying to put out in these factories, and they're working 24/7. I do think it happened, but I think that it probably would have been stopped overtly very quickly not so much because people thought it was important in terms of behavior, but because it impacted the factory's ability to get the job done. But how did men respond to this? You know, it's interesting that popular culture reflects a different view of this than what we think of if you think of the kind of propaganda of history. As time went on, popular culture kind of emphasized the humorousness of this topic. And I'm going to go back for a minute. The poster, Rosie the Riveter, this is a good example. It was this sort of jokey, and I don't mean that in a total negative sense, but it's sort of this funny movie where Rosie the Riveter, and she's the character here in the middle of the screen, they are forced to go to California where they end up in this house and they're sharing this room with two men, and the whole thing is sort of slapstick comedy. I think in popular culture, you saw enough comedic sides of this come out over time that it really is clear that there were men who took this very seriously. And then there were people who always saw it sort of as a joke. In fact, when I was doing some research for a blog post last week about Winnie the Welder and other factory figures like this, there were some quotes that came out in the newspapers of Americans got so tired of comedians, typically male comedians, using the idea of a woman welder as a punchline that they just started tuning out. So I do think it was there, and I think it happened. I think to some degree, we simply don't see it overtly reflected in materials as much as the reality of the situation is because it was sort of hidden on the surface. But do I think that there were men who just thought this was a joke? Yes, there probably were.
Good. And one last quick question that you may or may not know the answer to. Are there any Rosie the Riveters who are still with us, who are still alive? Do you know of any that are still around?
There are. I know that just recently there was a story done by a woman for the Smithsonian Magazine and another group here in Pittsburgh where they did find a few people. Now, unfortunately, and I'm not the only staff member who looked, it doesn't seem like any of our, or few of our Rosies who were working at the plants in this area are still around. Although a few years ago, there was a woman who had done welding with American Bridge at Draveau who actually stopped and visited when one of the big LST, the ocean vessels, is still floating. It's still on the Ohio River. There's a volunteer group that works on it. And I know one of the women who had welded it stopped back to visit it the last time it was in Pittsburgh. But they're getting really rare. That's one where afterwards, whoever has asked that question, I can pull out a few things and send you some information. There are a few. I think that the reporters who were looking, they found a woman in Carnegie who actually had worked with, was it Bethlehem Steel on the other side of the state? But, you know, of course, they're getting fewer and fewer as time goes on.
Yeah, that would be nice to include in the links that we send to teachers, maybe if you can find some of that. It's always nice to have that local, you know, real person angle, especially if they're still around.
And there are also some great oral history sites where you can actually watch videos of these women discussing their experiences online. If you're interested, that's a wonderful place to go and get kind of the firsthand testimony of multiple people as to what these women experienced in the factories.
Great. All right, well, that's all the questions that we had, and it is well past time for us to wrap up now. So thank you so much, Leslie, for sharing all of that wonderful knowledge with us and helping us get a little deeper into what we all think we know about Rosie the Riveter. Thank you to Jocelyn for keeping an eye on the chat there. Thank you to our captioner for keeping up with us while we were talking through this. And thank you to all of you for sticking with us and joining us this afternoon. Teachers, you will receive a follow-up email from me either this afternoon or tomorrow morning, depending on how long it takes the recording to process, that will have the recording, some links for further research, and a survey so you can let us know what you thought of the program today. But thank you all so much for joining us, and you are all good to go. Thank you so much.